So today we are concentrating on greenwashing, which is a great topic, I would say, and very, very up to date, since more and more companies have been either accused of or found out to be greenwashing. What is greenwashing? Greenwashing is the process of conveying a false impression or providing misleading information about how a company product are much more environmentally sound in an attempt to mislead consumer. And the first alarm bell arrives exactly when one explains what greenwashing is, because it's always about environmental and never about social. So when you go in and explore about how a product is being made, the wages, for example, the social impact in a community is never or rarely calculated and spoken about. So it's way more important that a product is produced in a recycled material for a brand rather than being produced in normal material by garment workers that are paid a living wage. With Eco-Age, we have been operating in sustainability for the past 14 years, and we have actually seen it all in terms of greenwashing and the rise of greenwashing. Fortunately, we've been very good at cutting through the noise, and recently there have also been some groundbreaking reports, such as the Changing Markets License to Greenwash report and the Great Greenwashing Machine 2 reports by Dorothée Baumann-Pauly from the Geneva Institute for Business and Human Rights, and Veronica Bates-Kassatly, who are both with us today, and we are very lucky to have them with us. Now, although my temptation is to give some pretty strong examples of recent greenwashing, as most people know, I never shy from saying it as it is, I will today leave to our experts to talk about the issues and the solutions more than anything to help you navigate the fashionscape in a correct way. And I'm very happy to now pass the baton to the wonderful Auret van Heerden, who I known and worked with for many, many years. Auret has been working on human and labor rights issues in global value chains for over 40 years. He started while at the university in South Africa. He continued at the ILO and the Fair Labor Association, and now runs the Swiss consultancy company Equiception. Auret is also the co-founder of the Fair Wage Network and has recently launched Ripple Research, which is an IE-powered social analytics company. So, Auret, over to you.
Thanks, Livia, and hi to everyone. I was just going to add a couple of comments by way of introduction and to set the stage for the panelists to follow. And, you know, I'm struck listening to you, Livia, that we're really entering into a new era, something of a sea change in terms of how companies operate in global value chains. We're coming out of 20 or 30 years of voluntary standards, this sort of CSR era, and moving into a new era of mandatory standards, mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence. And this implies a lot of changes in the way companies manage or approach human rights and environmental issues in their global value chains. For one, due diligence is an ongoing exercise of risk identification. It's not an annual social audit. It's not an occasional check. It's not a 2-year certification, kind of pretend and extend. This is ongoing due diligence. And that means being able to collect data from along the value chain, from a bunch of business partners and suppliers that you don't own or control, and to rely on that data to be able to inform regulators or investors or consumers and other stakeholders. And that's a big ask. That's a big challenge compared to social auditing. But this comes together with another parallel initiative that a lot of regulators are taking, which is to increase the amount of non-financial data which companies are expected to report, specifically sustainability data. And the US is also a drive to increase the amount of data reported on human capital issues. So you've got this increased expectation as regards non-financial reporting requirements. And the third, of course, is ESG, which, it's early days in the ESG movement, and we're not quite sure if it's going to make it. But clearly right now, it's a major issue for a lot of investors and a lot of companies. So you've got at least these three sets of expectations: due diligence, non-financial reporting, and ESG, crowding in and putting a lot of pressure on companies to be able to collect data on these material risks and report that data. And of course, with some of these things, we don't even have an agreed upon metric yet. And some of the metrics are really hard to collect. So, life cycle analysis could take a long time, right? So not all of these things scale very easily. So obviously companies are going to get it wrong. There's some of the stuff they're just going to get it wrong. With the best intentions in the world, they'll get it wrong. And they're going to end up in controversies about whether they were intentionally trying to mislead a stakeholder or multiple stakeholders. So that's why we decided to hold this webinar, because clearly we need to come together as a diverse group of experts and practitioners and stakeholders and try and figure out how to do this well, because we're going to have to get good at it. It's clear, whatever form this takes, knowing and showing is going to be the name of the game, and we just got to get good at it fast. So I'm relying on the panelists to light the way for us. So let's get into it.
Thank you so much, Auret. And I wrote in the chat, I'm so sorry, my Wi-Fi crashed exactly at the right moment, which was brilliant. I think to start properly the conversation going in depth, I think it would be great if David from the Competition and Consumer Authority started outlining the point of view of actually the bodies regulating greenwashing. David is the legal director at the CMA and specializing in consumer protection law, has been with the CMA since 2014, David, is that correct? And you have advised on the CMA's work across a variety of sectors. And prior to joining the CMA, David was a lawyer at the Office of Fair Trading. So currently is part of the team which has been looking at the consumer protection law implications of environmental claims in specific. David, over to you.
Thanks very much. And thank you for inviting me along to join this panel today. So just in terms of what the CMA does, as you mentioned, we are the UK's primary competition and consumer authority. And our objective is to use our powers to make markets work well for consumers, for businesses, and for the broader economy. And now, because environmental sustainability is such an important issue, supporting a more sustainable economy has become a real strategic priority for us at the CMA. And that has been a big prompt for our increased involvement in this space. And also, I think the interplay between sustainability and competition and consumer regimes is a really live issue, both in the UK and internationally. So it's been a major topic of discussion in international forums like the OECD, the International Competition Network, the International Consumer Protection and Enforcement Network, and UNCTAD. And I think on top of that, concerns about the environment and sustainability are really changing market dynamics and consumer behaviours. And so it's really an area that has been right for us to get involved in. I think we think that competition and consumer law can help to produce outcomes that do have important sustainability benefits, which reflect that changing landscape. So by way of example, we say that consumer law helps consumers to make informed and confident decisions, and therefore helps them to consume more sustainably, which we believe they want to do. That then leads to more competition as more and more businesses try to deliver those sustainable products that consumers want. That drives more efficient use and allocation of resources, but also really importantly, it drives the type of innovation that's required to ensure that the production of goods and services is more sustainable. And we call that the virtuous circle. And when it works well, everyone benefits. So consumers get the sustainable products they want, businesses who improve their sustainability are rewarded, and the economy benefits and becomes more sustainable as a result. So I suppose we think of it a little bit like letting consumer power help to drive improvements. But for that to work, businesses need to be competing on how green and sustainable they actually are, and not just on their marketing. Because if people aren't able to choose what they want, because the information they get is misleading, if they're not getting what they expect, then that virtuous circle breaks down before it starts. So we've been focusing on claims made by businesses in their marketing, and whether we need to use consumer protection law to make sure that they aren't misleading, and also trying to educate businesses and give them tools to help them get it right. We've produced guidance for businesses which sets out various principles we think that they should follow. There are 6 of them, but today I wanted to highlight 3, I guess, recurring themes from the guidance, which I think is really important for businesses to be thinking about. The first one of those is accuracy. Is what you say correct? Is it true? And is it the whole picture? And can you back it up with data and stand behind it? The second is about understanding. So what will your customers understand from your messages? You might not intend to create a particular impression, but you should take a step back and think, if I was a customer looking at this, what would I take away from it? And then I think the third is culture, because getting this right starts at the top of an organization and has to be embedded throughout. So are people being trained to think about things like accuracy and understanding? Are people sense checking and reviewing what's being said? Are there appropriate safeguards in place? Because ultimately, if something goes out in a business's name, then the business is responsible for it. And I think that that culture piece also extends to suppliers. So if your messaging relies on what they do or on what they tell you, are you making clear to them what you expect? Are you checking, and do you have the right safeguards in place around their processes and their information? And I think also it extends to accreditation schemes. So do you understand what a scheme does? Do they actually relate to the products that you're advertising or your activities? And do your marketing claims reflect what the accreditation schemes do, especially if there are important qualifications in relation to what they cover? And I think those 3 things kind of underpin the different principles that we think people should follow. And so just in terms of what we've been doing, as I mentioned, we've put out guidance on making green claims. That's available on our website. We call it the Green Claims Code, and it sets out the 6 principles that I've mentioned. And there's a fairly detailed document which provides our views and gives you a lot more detail on how we think consumer protection law applies and what businesses can be doing. And then there's also a checklist which you can use to assess individual claims. And there's a microsite with summaries and videos. So I'd say that's definitely worth a look. And then the guidance came out, I think, in May last year. So what we've done is we've given businesses an opportunity to kind of digest, to review their practices, and potentially to make changes. And now we're going back and looking at what businesses are doing. And we've been focusing in particularly on the fashion retail sector. We've recently opened 3 investigations in relation to ASOS, Boohoo and Georgia Tasda, and we'll be taking a closer look at what those particular businesses are saying. But our wider review of the fashion sector and potentially other sectors is continuing, and we'll be considering whether to open further investigations. So I think we are really committed to backing up our guidance with further action if needed. And I think the other thing to flag is that we're not the only ones active in this space. So the Advertising Standards Agency, which is the independent self-regulatory body for advertising, and I'm sure many people in the UK will be familiar with, they have really been focusing on green claims as well. And also other regulators like the Financial Conduct Authority are building ESG considerations into their sector-specific rules. So I think what you'll see is a general move, or more of a move, towards greater scrutiny of green and environmental claims from a variety of regulatory bodies and in a variety of different contexts. So that's kind of the regulatory perspective at the moment.
Thank you, David. It's very, very interesting to look at the picture from the environmental point of view, and particularly what you talked about, accuracy. Is it the whole picture when we talk about data? And as we will go and see, this is a very, very complex issue, but also in a way incredibly simple, because it very rarely is the whole picture. But also you touch on a very important topic, which we will, I'm sure other panelists will address, which is the information relies always on suppliers, and are they gonna give you what you want? And how this system works, or in fact doesn't work, is another interesting aspect that the panelists will go and touch about. But greenwashing is for information. In terms of greenwashing, information has to be easily accessible and verifiable. And in terms of substantiating and the accuracy of the data, I'm very happy to have here Professor Dorothée Baumann-Pauly, who directs the Geneva Center for Business and Human Rights, which is the first human rights center at a business school in Europe. But since 2013, and in fact, this is the first time that Dorothée and I met personally, she's also the research director at NYU Stern Center for Business and Human Rights at New York University. And in these roles, Dorothée works with companies to advance human rights in corporate practice. Dorothée was one of the two authors of the Great Greenwashing Machine reports. So over to you, Doro, now to go even more in depth into the issue.
Thank you, Livia. Thanks for having me and for your kind introduction. And you asked me to tease out themes from my work that highlight that we're not capturing the whole picture yet, as you said. So let me mention 3 themes, and then I'll hand over to Veronica, who will take an even deeper dive into the data challenges that we're currently facing. So the first theme that I want to highlight again, and you also mentioned it in your introduction, Livia, is the fact that sustainability to this day is mostly green. So we're assessing environmental impacts and we're overlooking social impacts in our sustainability assessments. And if we're serious about the Agenda 2030 global economy that leaves no one behind, a comprehensive understanding of sustainability, separating out social and environment makes no sense. And I want to give you one example for that. It's become good practice to refer to organic cotton cultivation, for example. And if you take a soil sample from a place that produces cotton organically, if you only look at the soil sample at a specific point in time, you may conclude, indeed, organic cultivation is better for the planet. But as you add social impacts and the impact on people, you may realize that the assessment may be wrong. Why? Because farmers that produce cotton organically may have to work harder and longer hours. They may produce less and as a result earn less, so have lower wages. They may be trapped in poverty for longer, particularly smallholder farmers and, let's say, an African country. In addition, they are still using fertilizers, but organic fertilizers, animal manure, and in many African countries, the #1 cause of death for children under 5 years old is dehydration from diarrhea. Well, if organic cultivation uses animal manure, bacteria from animal manure may go into drinking water sources in countries that don't have secure drinking water sources. So we need to consider a very complex system as we make sustainability assessments. And I think the example shows that social and environmental impacts are inextricably linked and we cannot look at them in an isolated way. That's theme #1, and it's very foundational. Theme #2, I think, is that we have for a long time in academia's global supply chain analysis focused too narrowly on one part of the global supply chain only, namely the relationship between buyers and suppliers. We've looked into working conditions at factories because we considered the most salient human rights risk occur at those production sites. But in a simplified way, the supply chain of garments starts with fiber production, then the relationship between brands and suppliers, then business models and how companies sell, and then of course what happens to the product after disposal. And given the geopolitical situation we're in, as well as the climate emergency, I believe we need to, as business human rights scholars and practitioners, start to be more concerned about the business models that both drive systemic human rights risks into the supply chain, but that also determine how a company sells its products. And the business models that have been most successful in the recent years have radically changed how they sell their product. It's become ultra fast fashion, from fast fashion to ultra fast fashion, with garments mostly produced made of polyester. The percentage of polyester garments keeps going up, which of course has huge impacts in the afterlife of a garment. Third point, third theme that I want to highlight is that we still need better data and greater transparency in this industry. This is not a new requirement. As I started working with Auret van Heerden in the Fair Labor Association almost 20 years ago, the quest for greater transparency has been going strong already. At the time, the demand from civil society organizations was to publish the factory lists, the production sites where brand produce. Since so much more data has become available from the industry, but we need to critically, I think, ask ourselves, has this more data actually delivered on our objective for greater accountability? Is it the kind of data that we need to better understand this industry and hold corporations accountable? So in my recent work with Veronica, we have pointed out that the data from life cycle analysis is actually on very shaky grounds. These life cycle analyses underpin commercial databases that eventually inform the sustainability decisions of consumers and investors. And we find that there are major flaws. I'll let Veronica elaborate on this point, but from a scholarly management perspective, relying on such poor data is highly risky for corporations, because as they project a green image using such weak data, any evidence that calls these sustainability claims into question can backfire in terms of their reputation. What I call the corporate legitimacy that they built up over years can be lost within seconds. And so it's a very risky business strategy to project a green image or responsible image without having robust data to underpin it. And I'm very happy that David just elaborated on how his agency is now paying great attention to this and requires, he outlined 3 criteria for more robust data. And of course, there's now also, in addition to the risks to corporate legitimacy, pressure from regulatory agencies to get it right and do better. And I think we can do better. And with this, I'm happy to hand over to Veronica. Thank you.
Okay, shall I just start straight in? I mean, I think we can't say often enough.
Veronica,
yes.
Can I introduce you first?
Please, darling, go ahead.
I am sorry, but you know, you cannot be the only one who doesn't get introduced today. But also because you have been scouting and analyzing data for a very, very long time. We enjoyed enormously your articles in the past, famously going through investigative data analysis. And, you know, you are a former fellow of the Overseas Development Institute, where you focus on agricultural economics. So you know one or two things about one of the topics that Doro was touching on, that is the relationship. The data is not only about the relationship between the buyers and the suppliers, but it's also about fiber and where that fiber comes from. So agriculture is a huge part of that data collection. You are also a former economist and a financial analyst with the World Bank, where you cover textile and technology development. So that's all to say that you are mighty, and we know that you will chase us all if we don't provide the right information.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. I don't think we can say often enough, so I'm just going to repeat it once. It is completely unjust to only look at environmental impact and not at socioeconomic impact as well. But then we have to ask ourselves, okay, so everyone's making environmental claims. How reliable are these environmental claims? Now, the most common means of substantiating environmental claims is through life cycle analysis, or LCAs. And Dora and I just recently published a white paper that's available open source on the website of the Geneva Center for Business and Human Rights. It's called The Rise of Life Cycle Analysis and the Fall of Sustainability, which I think gives you some idea of the content. And this is a screenshot of the cover. So that's so that you should be up here so that you can see what it looks like and you can be sure that you're reading the right report. Now, I only have a few minutes to cover this topic, so please, please go and read the full paper.
We will circulate the paper, Veronica, anyway, to everyone.
Perfect, perfect. Okay. So in a nutshell, going back to what Auret said right at the beginning is that your companies are going to be increasingly required to account for sustainability as they are required to account for their financial activities. But sustainability doesn't have, sustainability accounting doesn't have a framework that everyone adheres to and for which outcomes are audited. There is no established LCA model that everyone in the apparel sector uses. Now, the International Organization for Standardization, or ISO, has guidelines. And many commercial LCAs in particular will tell you that they were produced to ISO standards. But an array of different methodologies and boundaries are ISO compliant. Whilst a standard for data collection, and data is the most crucial variable in every LCA model because this is a statistical model, such a standard doesn't appear to exist. And there is, moreover, no real oversight of any of it. And there's plenty more detail on that in our paper. Now, the first thing to realize is that LCAs are not absolute. They are not a sausage machine. They are not a cookie cutter. From any given set of raw data, there is no single unique value that will automatically be generated for greenhouse gas emissions, water consumption, eutrophication, et cetera, and as I will show you in a minute, vastly different purported impacts can be obtained from exactly the same data by using different models, different methodologies, and or different boundaries. Now, reverting to what someone was saying earlier about transparency, or what several people said, ISO 14021/2016 in fact states that consumer-facing claims cannot be made if the verification depends on confidential business information. But nobody adheres to this. From the HIG MSI to brand and manufacturer websites, you will find claims based on LCAs, and these LCAs are not available to the general public. At best, you'll just be given some kind of a summary. And it's really the nitty-gritty that you need to know about. And we're about to see why this is so problematic. Now, referring to what David was mentioning earlier, he mentioned the CMA's Green Claims Code. And this requires, I'm going to point out, point 6, which is that these claims be substantiated. Business models should be able to back up their claims with robust, credible, and up-to-date evidence. Great. But what constitutes robust, credible, and up-to-date evidence? So let's start with the final point. Well, what constitutes up-to-date? Now, if you go to the HIG portal, and you click on the data link for the MSI for cotton fiber organic, referring to what Dorothée was talking about earlier, cotton fiber organic, this is a screenshot of what you will see. Is the screenshot up? Yes, perfect. Okay, so this states that Sveriggabi is the source, and Sveriggabi note, and you can see this circled in red, that this data set underpinning the MSI for organic cotton ceased to be valid and after 2017. Yet 5 years later, in 2022, the MSI is still using this LCA, to claim that organic cotton consumes 92% water and emits 45% less GHGs in cultivation than conventional cotton production. Now, that the LCA, in fact, doesn't substantiate either of these claims is a completely different matter. Here, we are just looking at what constitutes up to date. Now, Sverre, who were formerly known as PE Consulting, actually wrote that reference LCA. They say it's no longer statistically valid. HIG, and indeed Zalando, who used precisely this claim in their July 16, 2021 submission to the CMA itself, and are actually using that 90% less water claim on their UK website right now. I took a screenshot of it yesterday. Both of these parties obviously disagree. They clearly think that it's still valid. So, who is correct? The second point, what constitutes credible? In their submission to the CMA, Zalando refers to the HIG MSI as, and I quote, the apparel industry's most trusted tool to measure and score the environmental impact of materials. But since June 16, 2021, a complaint from the International Sericulture Commission about the way in which the MSI calculates its scores has been included in the US Federal Trade Commission's secure online database. And this is a screenshot of the FTC letter announcing that inclusion. We got that up? Yes, perfect. This is going well. Okay, so this letter states that the FTC database is, and I quote, used by thousands of civil and criminal law enforcement authorities worldwide. This database enables law enforcement agencies to identify questionable business practices that may lead to investigations and prosecutions. Now, representatives of the silk and alpaca industries submit that this means that the HIG MSI data cannot be deemed credible. It's self-evident that the SAC, HIG, and all the brands who still use the MSI disagree. Who is correct? And the last point that I'm going to get onto, because we're running out of time, is what constitutes robust. The screenshot that you see now comes from the white paper that I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, so I hope we can have a look at that. We adapted this from a wool LCA, which was comparing the greenhouse gas emissions, the GHGs, of 4 different sheep ponds, you see the 4 different colors, by applying 7 different methods of allocation between wool and meat. So that's the 7 different blocks. Now, all 7 of these methods are acceptable under ISO standards. So this could, to some extent, apply to any fiber. Now, if you look at the red bar, this represents the GHG impact of just one farm, farm 1. And note, we're just talking GHGs, a single variable, all right? So this is the GHG emissions of farm 1. If using system expansion, that farm claimed that their GHG impact was negative and that buying their greasy wool actually reduces climate change to the tune of almost 30 kilos of CO2e per kilo of wool. Now that's a little red bar that's under the line that you can see on the right-hand side. See, almost minus 30, right. Okay, so that this saved almost 30 kilos of CO2e per kilo of wool. Would that claim be robust? Or if an index such as those owned by Sphere or Qantas used protein utilization, so over on the left side, to claim that farm 1's wool had a GHG impact of almost 40 kilos of CO2e per kilo of wool, would their claim be robust? Now, our white paper concludes that legislators cannot rely on commercial databases and commercial LCA providers to inform legislation. We strongly recommend that brands not be allowed to make any consumer-facing comparative assertions until there is agreement on aligned methodologies and until the yawning data gap, we haven't had much time to cover that, there's plenty of it in our paper, until the yawning data gap and agreement on aligned methodologies has been, you know, the gap has been filled and the agreement on the methodologies has been reached. Because in the interim, you can't really, you know, as you saw from those 3, that you can't really tell as to what brands could do if they really wanted to reduce impact. As Doro was saying, they could introduce more equitable contracts. They could make long-term bankable purchasing commitments. They could source yarn and fabric from France due to its low carbon intensity of its grid mix and the fact the minimum wage is living wage. Or they could source from solar-powered Bangladeshi mills, you know, proving that they're minimizing GHG emissions in spinning and weaving. Now, all of these moves would cost more, but their positive impact would be real and measurable. And please note, we're not the only people taking the position that brands would be advised to stick with what is real and measurable. Going forward, brands are not going to have to reckon not just with the CMA, we've just heard, for or the Norwegian Consumer Authority. I think Tona's about to talk to you a bit about that. A class action suit was actually filed against H&M for making misleading sustainability claims about its products in New York in July. And as to what all of this means for brands, I quote a leading authority in fashion law, Alan Baer, and this is what he has to say. The key learning is, unless you and you alone really can be sure that what you are doing is better for the environment, it is far too early in all this to start boasting about it in your marketing materials. I think all I conclude is that we suggest that everyone should follow his advice. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Veronica. And I think you gave exactly the right picture of why the Norwegian Consumer Protection Agency ruled illegal the HIG index in consumer-facing marketing. So Tone Tobiasson, we're very happy that she's here with us because you work very closely on the what we call the Norway case. Tony is a journalist and an author. He went from managing editor of fashion magazines to become a founder of Niche Fashion, which is the Nordic initiative Clean and Ethical. Tony currently is responsible for the dissemination for several research projects in Norway, which are related to wool, to localism, sustainable, slow, and regenerative fashion. She has co-written also a number of books, and she's contributed to several international publications and a board member of the Union of Concerned Researchers in Fashion. So Tony, over to you.
Thank you so much, Livia, and I'm so glad to be part of this panel. And I've been listening to all the other panelists, and I'm just overwhelmed by all the knowledge that is in this room. And all the good work that everyone is doing, because to give a little backdrop to my history, back in, I think it was around 2011, was made aware of this made by tool, and the made by company doesn't exist anymore. It disappeared from from the world, I think, a couple of years ago. But they had made this overview of fibers' environmental impact, and as the reddest of the red was wool, and as the most sustainable fiber you could choose was, of course, the synthetic polyester. And of course, when being faced with this type of tool, which showed so clearly in the green and yellow and red what fibers you should avoid if you wanted to work sustainably, we just couldn't grasp how this was possible, and that's how I started learning about LCAs. And I co-authored a paper back then called Pulling Wool Over Our Eyes, the Dirty Business of LCAs, with Kjersti Kviseth. And we presented this at a conference in Copenhagen, and I think it raised quite a few eyebrows. And it also started opening up this whole discussion around LCAs and what were they actually measuring. Because it does seem that one is counting what can be counted and not what actually counts. Since I started working then with Nice Fashion and the Nordic Fashion Association, we were becoming more and more engaged with the Sustainable Apparel Coalition. And at one point in time, I was asked if I wanted to join one of the working groups in the Sustainable Apparel Coalition when it came to working on the HIG tool, actually. But at that point in time, I said that Kjersti Kviseth, who I'd co-written the paper with, had much more in-depth knowledge on fibers than I did. So I wanted her to take that place in the working group. Several years later, she pulled out because she became so, what should I say, disengaged with she saw how the small actors were just being overrun by the big businesses, and she just pulled out because it couldn't stand by and watch what was happening. Of course, we know that at one point in time, then the Sustainable Apparel Coalition decided that they wanted the HIG tool to underpin a label that was going to be used facing towards the consumer. And we were, of course, thinking that this would be much further into the future, because we knew how the data was still being questioned, how the ratings of the fibers were being questioned, and suddenly it was out there, and we had the Norwegian company Norrøna, which was the first company who started using the HIG label, and so this happened spring about a year ago. and we were having an informal summer meeting at the house of Janne, who is the person in the Friends of the Earth, the Norwegian Nature Conservancy organization. And I brought to her attention what was actually happening then with Norrøna, and that they had started using HIG as a consumer-facing label. And she said, this is something we really should grab a hold of. And she went to the Norwegian Consumer Protection Agency and asked them if they thought this was interesting as a case of greenwashing, and they said yes. So here you see Norway is a very small country. We have a very open culture, so that it's very, you can go to authority people and you can actually talk to them and ask them, you know, is this something we should pursue? And they will give you an immediate honest opinion, and then you can go ahead and start working on it. So we got lots of help from Veronica in substantiating why we thought this should be taken down. It took a year, a lot of work from the lawyers in the Norwegian Consumer Protection Agency, who really seriously went into an area that they had really very little knowledge about, so that they needed a lot of information, which we, through Veronica, did give them. And then they actually also had a meeting with the Sustainable Apparel Coalition. And after telling Norrøna that the claims should be taken down, Norrøna said they had, of course, I think over about a month to answer. The Sustainable Apparel Coalition came back with a letter that was like 30 pages long, which did not answer the questions that the Norwegian Consumer Protection Agency actually had. It was a major sort of fogging up of the issues. And so after that, they had a meeting with the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, and the Sustainable Apparel Coalition admitted they did not have the data to back the claims. So about a month later, Norrøna was told that they had to take down the claims and the label from their website. H&M were informed that if they used the HIG label on the Norwegian market, they would have severe problems with the NCA, and they would probably get a fine. And also the Sustainable Apparel Coalition was told to inform all their members that this would be illegal to use in Norway, and that also Norwegian Consumer Protection Agency was going to contact all their European colleagues and inform them of the decision. And yesterday, we now see that the Sustainable Apparel Coalition has had a new meeting with the Norwegian Consumer Protection Agency, because the Norwegian Consumer Protection Agency really doesn't want people to make these mistakes. So they are now informing the Sustainable Apparel Coalition what they can and cannot say. So this will be, of course, an ongoing process, and it's going to be pretty serious, I think, also for the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, because they really, really need to have this clear, accessible, and verifiable information. Otherwise, it's going to be greenwashing.
Thank you, Tone. We heard from everyone how the regulatory bodies are paying a much, much closer attention to what companies communicate. We heard about the complexities in collecting the right data, that the data can only be about environmental, but also has to be about social. The data has to be accurate and robust. By no means, this means that companies should stop collecting that data, because they absolutely need to know the impact that they have on the planet and on the communities where they operate. But we have been advised to stop using the collection of the data that they think they have that is accurate, in order to convince consumers to buy their products because they're more sustainable than others. But Auret, in this as I said at the very beginning, is a complex issue, but in a way is very, very simple. So how do companies move forward now? And what are the solutions for a company? And I'm sure that we will have many more questions in the Q&A in 5 minutes.
That's a very big question, Livia. Solutions, of course, is a dirty word, but what I'm listening to the different speakers, the various presenters, I'm struck by how we're almost in the worst of all possible worlds, because companies feel they've got to say something. You know, their competitors are saying something, their consumers expect something, so you've got to put something out there, and you grab what you've got, right? And unfortunately, and you might even really believe that you've grabbed something valid, but until you get a challenge like in Norway, and you realize, oh, I needed to look a little bit more deeply at this, and maybe it's not a well-founded, robust, timely, up-to-date statement. So I feel for those companies. You know, they're trying to do the right thing, and all the incentives right now are pointing the wrong way. You know, so we need to create a situation where there's better data out there, or there are clear guidelines as to how to collect better data. And that really raises for me the need for co-creation of this data, because you've got to collect it from suppliers, you've got to collect it from farmers, maybe farmer co-ops or whatever. But those agencies, those organizations are not trained to do this right now. They're not equipped to do this. And so we're going to need a process of shared responsibility to produce this data together, and to stand by it together. And that goes as much for ESG data as it does for mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence. You know, so there's no one entity who can collect all of this data from raw materials to recycling and vouch for it all. You know, we're going to have to do it collectively. And that's going to involve a lot of capacity building, a lot of resource sharing, basically, and burden sharing along the value chain. There might be some technological solutions to this. You know, certainly we've got more and more data flowing along the value chain now. We've got the Internet of Things. We've got Industry 4.0 facilities which are generating this kind of data. And that will only grow. And you could start to model some of this using AI tools and techniques. But we're going to need a set, and I'm looking to, you know, Dorothée and Veronica and others, and the guidelines of the CMA and so on. We really need to be able to provide clear guidelines, tools, techniques to generate more reliable data. I think we're going to need, I'm really interested in what Tony was saying about being able to go, and I think David said this as well, being able to actually go and sit with regulators and say, okay, what are your expectations? How do I meet your expectations? I want to do the right thing. I just don't know how to do that right now. And get help from regulators and academia and other, you know, research institutes to be able to collect good data. And we're going to need to have we need forums to have really honest exchanges. You know, it's no use just sort of kind of throwing dirt and hoping, you know, wondering what will stick and what won't. We really need fora where we can come together and the different groups can say, okay, look, this is what I've got. This is how I got there. What do I do? What do I do to make it better? You know, I'm hoping we can engage in a constructive, tough love exchange to really be able to avoid this worst of all worlds, which I think ESG, by the way, is extremely close to. You know, I think there's so little confidence right now in ESG data that the currency, you know, they need to devalue it. They need some adjustment to the exchange rates because it's really not doing what it should be doing right now. And I would hate to see that apply to the rest of the environmental and social sustainability data we need.
Thank you, Auret. I see that there is a lot of questions coming up, and I think if we answer them as fast as possible, we can go through many of them, and please keep putting them in the Q&A chat. We'll go in order of answers submitted. So Philip Scull, unfortunately, I don't have your titles, but hopefully that is not important. It's asking what tools do consumers have to make conscious purchase decisions, since one of the most advanced consumer-facing tools like the HIG product model has been affected by the recent H&M lawsuit, as we said. What can companies do to protect themselves against greenwashing, even when they're making small but real steps? So who wants to take these questions? What tools do consumers have to make conscious purchases, and what can companies do to protect themselves against greenwashing? Veronica, do you want to talk about what tools do consumers have to make conscious purchases? Because I know you feel strongly about a couple of points of where the consumer responsibilities lies. You are on mute. You are on mute, Veronica. You are on mute. You're still on mute. Maybe let's start from Doro. Do you want to be the one that says what can companies do to protect themselves against greenwashing, or should David do?
I'm happy to start, and I will build on Auret's comments, because of course he said all the right things. I think brands and companies are critical actors to get us to better data. Auret mentioned the need to collaborate across the entire value chain and share responsibility for better data, but I think we also need to come together, brands with multiple stakeholders outside the industry, to standardize the methodologies. The wool chart that Veronica showed you earlier showed, as you apply a different methodology to the exact same thing, you arrive at very different outcomes. So we need to come to an agreement. What boundaries, what allocations, how are these distributed? What method do we want to use? So this is not a minor technical detail, but we arrive at radically different conclusions on the same fiber. We have to be a lot more specific and nuanced, and we have to agree on what method to apply. So that would have been my addition to Auret's explication. And clearly, companies could be in the driver's seat here, and they could commission independent studies to independent researchers and be leaders in bringing people to the table to arrive at such a common understanding of what methodologies to apply.
Thank you, Doro. Apologies if I didn't ask for inputs from the panelists on solutions before I opened the Q&A. David, what can companies do to protect themselves against greenwashing?
Well, I think a couple of things, just building on those points. So, I mean, obviously, firstly, making sure that that you think very carefully and make sure that your messages are honest and clear, and that those principles are at the heart of your marketing strategies. But just on this point about improved data, again, I come back to my virtuous circle. To a degree, businesses are customers to some of these accreditation schemes, and if there is a demand for greater transparency, again, it will drive innovation and it will drive better outcomes. So I think if there's a real desire to have more information or to include new metrics, then if that's what people want, that's what will have to be delivered, because people will be competing to provide accreditations and certifications. So I would say this, I work for Competition and Consumer Authority, but I do think competition has a role to play, not just in relation to the consumer facing side of things, but also in relation to the interactions between businesses and others. And just quickly as well, on the supply chain transparency, it is something that people have flagged to us, and that the government did ask us for a bit of advice on whether competition and consumer law could do more. And one thing that we did suggest to them was that there's fairly limited legislative requirements in relation to impact of supply chain in the UK, and that is something that the government could consider improving. And so legislating to improve supply chain transparency. And I think there is work going on internationally. I think the OECD have produced some guidelines on that front. I think there's legislation in Germany actually on supply chain transparency. So that is another potential option that for example, for the government to consider.
Thank you, David. Veronica, if you're not in mute anymore, what?
It said you unmuted me, so I think, can you hear me now?
Yes. So what tools do consumers have to make conscious purchases decisions?
Well, the most important thing that consumers can do is think how many times they're going to wear the item of clothing when they go to buy it. Because clothes are not a sandwich. You don't just wear them once, you're supposed to wear them multiple times. And this means that every time you wear your item of clothing, the impact that went into making it is being divided over more and more days. So in a way, our ability to reduce our own impact in terms of clothing is infinite because we can keep increasing the denominator. So when you go and you look at an item of clothing, don't just look at the price at the checkout. Think how many times will I wear it? How much is it costing me per wear? Am I getting a good deal here? Would I be better wearing something else? And similarly, there is no point, people shouldn't be told this is the impact of your clothing on a nice little label, least of all with a green, red and yellow label, which suggests that somehow one fiber or other is more sustainable than another, not least because all the charts I've been able to find based on best available data suggest that the fiber is only 10% of the total GHG emissions, lifetime emissions of a piece of apparel. So fussing about the fibers, you're fiddling at the edges. You really ought to be worrying about the way that it's manufactured, but obviously the consumers are never given information on this, difficult for them to understand. Just consider that if your item of clothing has an impact of 100 and you wore it twice, that was 50 per wear. If it had an impact of 1,000 and you wore it 1,000 times, it would be 500 times. You see how important the number of wears is. And I feel very strongly that consumers need, first of all, to be taught, or not taught, to be encouraged, seduced, because this is business, this is marketing. How do we persuade consumers that this is in their interest? Because it is in their interest. I mean, look, the EU data shows that whilst the average price for garment of clothing has fallen considerably over the past 10 to 15 years, the total amount that households have spent has risen. So they're not saving any money with this. It's an illusion to suggest that cheap, fast fashion has somehow been a huge benefit to the poor. There's no data to substantiate this whatsoever. And there was that very interesting study, if anybody can remember the name, of the health impacts of polyester that just came out. We should try to find that, stick it in the useful documents for people to read, that talks a lot about antimony in polyester, about the toxicity of polyester and the fact that antimony being a catalyst is integral in the fiber when you're wearing it, and about the health implications and how these fall unduly heavily on the poorest. So we shouldn't just be thinking, oh, cheap fashion, is a benefit to the poor. And we should really start thinking each person about how many times we wear a garment. And just one final point, if you wear something 100 times or 1,000 times, whereas somebody else is only wearing something twice, that means you're throwing away far less. There's far less ending up in Cantamanto, there's far less ending up in the Atacama. So, it's beneficial, the virtuous cycle on two sides.
Thank you, Veronica. We have a question from Colin Bidwell. And by the way, apologies if I misspell anyone's name, but it takes an Italian to always misspell everyone's name. So Colin is asking, to what extent should regulators act on sustainability versus legality in such areas as duty of care or tort by negligence against public, like healthcare, institutions, and anticipatory equality? Auret, do you want to answer this?
I'm wondering if David wants to have a first go.
Or David, you want to go first go?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think I read that as a question about prioritization for regulators and whether, if I've understood the question correctly, about whether sustainability should be a priority for us. And I think, as I mentioned, it may not be a traditional area, for example, for the Competition and Consumer authorities, but I think it is a very important one, and I think it is worthy of its place alongside the other work that we do. So yes, I think it is important that we do focus on these issues alongside the other, other areas of and other concerns that we might have. But I do think it is, it is an important area, and so is something that it is right for us to prioritise.
Thank you, David. Auret, do you want to add anything, or should we go on to another question?
No, I have nothing to add to that. I think you covered it. Thanks.
Hitachi Parek asked a favorite question of mine about what we think about Boohoo hiring Kourtney Kardashian as a sustainability ambassador. And because we can't swear on the panel, I think we can just answer like that. It's the biggest greenwashing operation of all. How can Mary Schwimmer is asking, how can young researchers support the process? Hold on, I lost the question. As questions start to come in, I lost the thread. Anyway, how can young researchers support this? Doro,
answer. Reach out to us. We'd love to increase our team. I hope that actually companies will reach out to young independent researchers and ask for help. So that would be great.
Thank you. Brett Matthews is asking, there is a lot of focus on big business when it comes to greenwashing, but for me, 3 MSIs are doing more harm than any brand in this area. Sustainable Apparel Coalition, Textile Exchange, and Better Cotton. Is it time to start talking more about these 3 and how they are facilitating greenwash?
Well, can I say something? I think that it's very important to start looking at a lot of these power structures, because what we are seeing is that we're seeing that these organizations are also, or these MSIs, are also getting together in constellations like the Policy Hub, like different types of constellations, and they're becoming even more powerful through that, and setting the agenda also for the discussion, because I really think we need to move the discussion over to other areas now. We've been discussing, which is the best fiber since 2011. We haven't gotten the answer. Each fiber needs to be used where it has the best function. That's the answer. I saw that was also one of the questions, which is the most sustainable fiber. But as Veronica mentioned, we really need to get into this dyeing and finishing area. If the fiber itself is 10% or 12% of the impact, the dyeing and finishing is like 36, 39% of the impact. You have to use a fiber to make clothing. You can't get around it. But do you really need all these neon colors? There are a lot of items of clothing that really don't need colors. Let's talk about underwear, night dresses, baby clothes. A lot of these clothes really don't need to be dyed. You don't need the forever chemicals like the PFAS that have just been outlawed or made illegal in California, and they're looking at the same thing in the EU. And this is the big black box that nobody's looking into, because it's so complicated and it's so full of issues that I think maybe we're intentionally hiding it from the consumer because it's not marked on the label. It's the fiber that's marked on the label, not all these other added chemicals, and some of them very, very hazardous to our health. We see a rise in allergy among children. We have a lot of parents trying to look for clothing that doesn't irritate the allergies, and that would mean no dyes, for example, and no chemical finishes on this clothing. And this is an issue that's not discussed.
Thank you, Tone. Auret, I have a question for you, because we've been discussing this and it's a very interesting question. How do you recommend brands share the burden of data collection with the value chain so that it doesn't fall totally on the already overburdened shoulders of farmers and suppliers? Which also goes back to what Doro was talking about, accuracy of data. Are we giving the whole picture? The collection of data is an interesting process, and today is very tainted and made very complicated. So do you want to go a little bit on that?
Sure, and in fact, I see there's another question in there from Ken Pucker asking, what can brands do now? You know,
Okay.
so I think the missing element in all of this work is that when brands communicate their expectations to suppliers, to the value chain, they assume that the value chain can figure it out. Okay, so the brand will make a commitment to greenhouse gas net zero, say, by X year. And they work backwards and they say, okay, that means X amount of saving by 2025 or 2030. And they eventually dial this down into a series of expectations for their value chain partners to meet, because they're the ones who have to do the doing, right? As you do that as a brand, sit down with your partner and say, do you have the wherewithal to do this? Are you ready, willing, and able to do this? What do you need to be able to do this? If I'm relying on you to do the doing, what do you need? Is it technical? Is it some technology? Is it some budget? Is it some training? Is it some knowledge sharing? So we have that conversation as we communicate expectations. And we know then that actually my business partner or supplier is in a position to meet these expectations, to generate the data that goes with this. And part of that conversation has to be on the metric thing. If we've agreed on the expectation, I now know that you have the wherewithal to deliver on it. What's the metric I'm looking for? And do you have the ability to measure that, right? So you then can enter into this process knowing that all of the rest of your team is actually equipped to play. Okay. Otherwise, what's really happening is the brands are the only members of the football team that has boots, right? And they're expecting everyone else to play the game. And to Veronica's point, we haven't agreed the rules yet, right? We don't know if we're playing rugby or soccer. So let's actually get these things sorted out. And that's what I mean by co-creation. And any brand which is not asking that question of their business partners and suppliers is pretending.
Thank you, Auret. That's a very clear point, which, I hope that the brands and the businesses participating today have heard loud and clear. And on this point also, collection, what data to collect and how to communicate. There are several questions, but I think we can all resume it into what Stepan Bashkevich from Prague is asking. I wonder whether the new EU strategy for sustainable and circular textile will have significant impact on the field of greenwashing, given the constraints we have with a weak data and methodology. And I think this is one of the focus of the panelists in the last year, for sure, how to make sure that in terms of proposed legislation, such as the PEF legislation at EU level, the correct methodologies is used, rather than the weak and inaccurate one of Higg index. So I don't know who wants to answer this question. Maybe Tone, do you want to start answering, and maybe Veronica and Doro can go into that as well a bit?
Yeah, I think one of the things that when it comes to the EU textile strategy, they have been very, very ambitious with the strategy, and they want to make fast fashion out of fashion, for example, and they want to, of course, halt greenwashing. But when it comes to the actual policies that are going to be implemented, of course, this is still a big question mark, is how and are they going to reach those goals? And when it comes to the greenwashing claims, they have signaled that it will be the product environmental footprint rules, or how they are end up being, that will be sort of the basis for what you can define as greenwashing or not. And that is worrisome, as I'm working very closely with Professor Ingunn Grimstad-Klepp and Kirsi Laitala at the Consumption Research Norway, SIFO at Oslo Metropolitan University, and both Kirsi and Ingunnar are feeding in information and data to the PEF working group on textiles and footwear. And there now, one of the big discussions is around the use phase. For example, as Veronica was describing, this is the big black hole, also a big black hole, because there's so much, there's so little research on, how long people actually keep clothes, how often they use them, and why they dispose of the clothing. And one of the things that one could do is, for example, have a rule that says that all products, when they go to market, are marked with a year when they go to market, so that when they end up either in the dustbin or in the collection, different collection organizations, they will see exactly how long the clothing has been used. And then you can start having a targeted producer responsibility fee, saying that, okay, your product was only used by the consumer for 2 years. This is not, you're going to have to pay a high price for that. While something that's used for 50 years or 100 years, of course, you're not going to pay anything in the other end. But what's worrying now is, of course, the way that one is talking about giving value to the consumer or the use phase, because right now they're looking at strength. And that's what is going to be the measure for a fiber, is how strong it is. And we all know polyester is one of the strongest fibers around. And that means, once again, polyester is going to be the winner in this competition. So there really needs to be a lot more research done into both the use phase and also the end of life.
Thank you, Donna. In fact, one of the questions that came from the participants was about which fiber is more sustainable. And I don't think we have time today to go into answering this question, but the Great Greenwashing Machine reports that will be circulated go in depth about certain fibers and their sustainability scoring with some surprising results. So I urge you to then explore that as a starting point. There was an article a question by Kevin Jelsey. Would it be legitimate to market and promote products with a certain certification? For example, GOTS as sustainable or more sustainable in relation to the conventional standard, given the conventional standard doesn't live up to the requirements of the certification framework. Please excuse the question, since the big conclusion of what you all are saying refers to the harmonization of methodology to measure metrics and the importance of taking complexity in the perception of data into consideration, but simply from the point of view from the average consumer. Doro, do you want to answer that?
Veronica wants to
Veronica.
answer.
I saw you for saying that, and I thought, no, but this is a question for Veronica for sure.
The thing, GOTS certifies that something is organic from the gin onwards. GOTS does not certify down to the field level. So you could argue, first of all, that since what determines whether the product is organic or not, whether cotton is organic or not, happens in the field, and GOTS doesn't certify from the field, it certifies from the gin gate, you could say that to tell consumers that this means that it's necessarily organic is misleading. And that obviously was part of the case that the New York Times made in that article, which came out, was at the end of last year, in which they discussed the, frankly, rampant fraud in the organic system. And one of the problems with organic cotton is it's much harder to grow organic cotton. It's much harder work physically. You can't use pesticides, or you can use only certain pesticides. So you tend to get more work, lower yield, unless you're compensated. You won't make any profit on your organic cotton. And so there is a tendency, there's an incentive, because all of this is business. There's a financial incentive to get other cotton, because there's a big demand for organic, but people just don't want to pay double. And so this obviously encourages people to market cotton as organic when it isn't. And since GOTS can't certify to the field level, does not certify, they could, I suppose, but they don't. And they're quite clear about this. You go on the GOTS website, they make no bones about it. They say it's from the gin gate onwards. So you could argue that telling someone that it's organic is moot. The second thing is the fact that it's organic does not automatically make it more sustainable. As Dora was already pointing out, and as you see here from the price problem, if the farmer didn't make as much money as his conventional counterparts, and there's a very good SEIA which is referenced, yes, definitely in the LCA paper that was produced by Air USA. It was commissioned by Loudis Foundation, 1,200 farmers of each type. And they found, it was considering BCI, organic and conventional, that the organic farmers had the highest debt and the lowest net income of the three. Now, you cannot claim that something that leaves the farmers worse off is more sustainable. It categorically isn't. So, and then obviously Dora was mentioning all the health implications of the manure when you don't have adequate water treatment, which aren't even mentioned or covered by any of it. So, and then, the LCA, which supposedly found the water consumption reduced and the reduced emissions, it's only because you don't include the manure. In short, there is no evidence that organic cotton is more sustainable. So you should not make any claim to anybody that organic is more sustainable. You can say that it has better toxicity outcomes, potentially better soil outcomes, I suppose. But I mean, I don't think you should be, yeah, I'm sorry, no, basically, you can't say it's more sustainable because it's got.
Thank you, Veronica. Louise Xin is asking a very pertinent question, which is something we have been campaigning for, actually. There is a forced labor ban resolution proposed by the EU, which means all the goods made by child labor and forced labor can no longer enter the European market. It's the most important law regarding the supply chain and future of fashion. Corporation and lobbyist groups are working hard on working against this law from happening. So how can we communicate to brands to support this law from happening? We simply can no longer continue to profit from human suffering, talking about sustainability, but profit from modern slavery is the biggest greenwash. This is, we opened this session today talking about how one of the biggest greenwash is to talk only about environmental and not social. And Louise, you are absolutely right. I think a lot of people on this panel can speak to this, but I have a question for David, actually, talking about this. Do you think the consumer authority, competition authority will move at some point from only looking at environmental and also assessing social?
I think potentially so. I mean, we do talk a lot about environmental claims, but I think ultimately, if you are making any claims in your marketing to consumers and that they are affecting their decisions, and those claims are misleading, then that's equally going to be a problem under consumer law. It doesn't just have to be about green claims. So, if you're making claims about workers' welfare or social responsibility, corporate social responsibility, and those claims are they're not accurate, and you can't back them up, then yes, that could also raise consumer protection issues. So I think you're right, we have focused a lot on the environment and green claims, but I think in our guidance, for example, we talk about sustainability claims more widely, and that's really anything to do with sustainability, sustainable consumption, sustainable development. So yes, I think it could include a whole variety of things, the things that we are concerned about. So yes.
Thank you, David. And Doro and Auret, I think you worked together, if I'm not mistaken, with NYU Stern in 2018, published a seminal report on fashion companies, particularly fast fashion companies, moving to countries such as Ethiopia to produce, and you look very much into the Ethiopian market at the time. Concluding, obviously, that the majority of companies were moving there because there was not even a minimum wage. But this is an issue that has been around for a long time. And it's true that you know, there are a lot of forces that want to bear it and remind everyone that it's all about environmental, but it's never about social. So what can we do to push the agenda forward, particularly on the regulation side?
I can start. I really think geopolitics start to matter more than ever for the supply chain architecture. And even if there's no law yet in the EU, there is already a law for the US, the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act, that certainly affects cotton as well, particularly since the Office for the High Commissioner for Human Rights finally released its report on Xinjiang last week, testifying that gross human rights violations and crimes against humanity may happen there. And I think this should really put all companies on alert. We know that over 80% of the cotton products coming out of China are produced from Xinjiang cotton. So that will have major impact on the supply chains. Equally in Ethiopia, we have a raging war in Tigray. So these geopolitical issues will impact supply chains, will require shifts. And I think companies are well advised to consider transitioning from many of those markets, figure out phase outs and transition plans to friendly markets. Yeah.
Thank you. I have a question from Hugo Martinez, which is very interesting, because maybe you just joined or you haven't been listening to the entire panel, because you say, I see from you many criticism, no proposal to resolve the problems, few real actions. You only see your local context while the problems are around the world. The world is not only UK or USA. How many mills have you visited? How many people have you helped with your talks? Go action instead. Greta have made more than you guys. So Hugo, we talked a lot about, obviously we had to showcase the issues and the problems. We talked extensively about solutions. And I think among, certainly between Auret, myself, Doro, and possibly Tone, have visited more mills and factories around the world than anyone we know. So that's my answer to your question. There is also a question about Emil Pettersson. I was so happy I wanted to make a LCA of the product. Oh, no, sorry. As a small apparel producer, I was pretty happy reducing the microplastic leakage in a fleece jacket with 70%, replacing 70% of the polyester with Tencel. I was so happy I wanted to make an LCA of the product. Problem is that an LCA of one item costs 25,000 euros. What can I do instead? Who wants to answer this question? I had no idea an LCA costs 25,000 euros. I learned one thing today in this panel. Who wants to answer this question? Because it's a very pertinent one. What can you do instead of an LCA if it costs so much money and a small producer cannot afford it? Who wants to answer this question?
I can start very briefly. I think LCAs have become a standard requirement in the industry, and it has also turned into an industry itself, which costs a lot of money to brands, yet our research highlights the flaws in this requirement. And I hope we also educate brands that keep requiring LCAs, that it's not a weapon for everything. LCAs can be useful for certain things, but not across the board. And we should critically reflect on whether it should still be a standard requirement, which costs too much money for many small brands.
Thank you, Doro. And I think we have time for one last question, because we're basically 3 minutes from the end of our session. Kim Warner is asking, do you think that brands focus on datafying everything is providing excuses or detracting them from taking concrete actions to clean up their practices and processes? Because they are investing in data collection and reporting, but not their operations. And I think, Auret, I would like you to answer this question.
These all go together, actually, and to respond to Hugo's point earlier as well, we've been making the point from the start of this webinar that we need to look at the entire system, right? The entire chain from raw materials to recycling. And we need to look at not just the environmental dimensions of it, but the social dimensions as well. They're integrated. You can't achieve either without an integrated, holistic approach. A really important report came out yesterday just highlighting how growing inequality is frustrating action on climate change, right? So we really are promoting, we're looking at all of the countries in the value chain, particularly the position of smallholder farmers, producers, workers in the value chain. And we're looking at ways of making sure that this works for all of them. And I want to emphasize here that we're going to need to take due diligence to an entirely new level. Audits collect so little information, it's not even funny, okay? It's pass, fail, yes, no, checkbox responses. We need data, and we need to interpret that data. We need to look at the data and ask new questions. Just look at Russia, Ukraine. We had flashing red lights for 18 months. How many companies took appropriate action? Ethiopia, we had a civil war raging there when companies were queuing to get into Ethiopia, okay? And of course it exploded in their faces, but it was not a surprise to anybody who'd actually looked at the facts on the ground. Take water. Anybody who's looked at the news the last couple of months knows that we've got a major, major problem with water. Either too little of it or too much of it. And garments export water, okay? There's embedded water in every apparel item, every piece of fabric. How much longer before a country like India or China or Pakistan says we cannot afford to keep exporting water, we don't have enough water to drink? These are issues which risk assessments need to be putting on the tables of boards of directors who are going to have to look at existential threats to their business. This is existential, folks. This is not a checkbox.
Thank you so much, Auret. On this note, thank you everyone also who participated. It has been a very interesting, constructive and informative discussion. I hope you will all agree. As we said at the beginning and replied to some of you privately in the chats, be assured that we're gonna circulate the recording, all the reports, the materials, that has been mentioned in this session. And if you want to know more, you will also have each one of us emails, and you can, direct your questions. And if you need help with anything, we will all be able to help. I think someone in one of the questions said that perfection cannot be the friend of progress, so I can't remember, but it's absolutely true. So by working together, doing system and collaborating, we can certainly solve some of the biggest hurdles that we face. And we look forward to welcome you to the following Shifting Tide panels in the next couple of months. We will inform everyone of the dates and the topics.